Welcome to Behavioral Health Today, a podcast brought to you by the Triad Network. This podcast is designed to share trending topics occurring within the world and our communities and bring them a behavioral and mental health perspective. Welcome to Behavioral Health Today. I'm your host, Peter Finger, and I'm joined by Charlie Dixon. Hey, Charlie, welcome.
Hey, Peter, how are you?
Yeah, I'm really excited. So I know today is another one of our BHT Bytes episodes where we'll break down one of our trending topics into a quick, relaxed, relevant conversation. So my topic today is I really wanted to talk a little bit about the changes that's happened to the National MFT exam. So if you've been through the licensure process, you know that the National MFT exam is the ultimate final hurdle for those to get licensed. Why we rely on the candidate handbook as our map, assuming that if we follow the rules that's laid out, we're on solid ground. But as of March 2026, the map was quietly redrawn. This was a change to the handbook and some of the weights that the exam is being scored without announcement. There's not an email or a notice on the website. The AMFTRB swapped their 2026 handbook with a newer version. Now, for anyone that's currently studying in the trenches, it kind of feels like the goalposts have been moved in the middle of the night. But today, we're going to take a look at some of these stealth changes and what it means and what the shifted domains look like, how they're weighted now, with an introduction of AI into their practice and really asking, what does it mean for our profession when the gatekeepers aren't transparent about the gate? I think that that's an interesting question. So let's just talk a little bit about the national MFT domain changes, right? So 6 core content designs are now changed their weights. Means that the percentage of questions have shifted. Right now, the exam is a total of 180 items with a 4-hour time limit. Previously, as of January 2026, the weights looked like 23% on the practice of systemic therapy. That's now been decreased to 18%. Assessing, hypothesizing, and diagnosing has gone from 16% to 17%, so fractional change there. Designing and conducting treatment, 22% to 24%, so a little bit more weight, and also almost a quarter of the exam based on that domain. Then evaluating, revising, and terminating from 12% to 11%, small decrease there. And then maintaining ethical, legal, and professional standards has now been increased from 11% to 15%. So a much more weight seen on that domain. And then lastly, managing the clinical office from 16% to 15%. So really what I see, the biggest changes, the biggest weights is a decrease in the practice of systemic therapy and an increase of designing and conducting treatment and then maintaining ethical and legal professional standards. I think the idea of this is really kind of rebalancing the exam. I know we've seen such trends as the ASWB exam changing this year. And so more emphasis on the practice of social work rather than, say, like knowing the technical terms. I think that's what we're sort of seeing here with the National MFT exam, that these weights have changed to reflect a current version of the practice. Some of the exams were heavily weighted are now decreased while others have grown. And for candidates, it really means that a study plan designed into 2026 may now be focusing a little too much or a little too less on specific content areas. So my question to you is if the board is shifting the weight on the exams, they're essentially refining what it means to have a competent entry-level therapist. By decreasing, say, like the old domains and increasing it elsewhere, what is the board really signifying about the evolving role of MFT in 2026?
Well, first, I agree with you that it seems like these changes are very similar to the changes that ASWB made this year. Really focusing more on how the practice is done, not necessarily just that book knowledge, just the theory, just those things that we learn just in class, but more so on how you actually are providing the therapy, the types of just the ethics of how the therapy works, not just the things that you learn in class, which As someone, I don't necessarily do therapy, but just as a practicing social worker or practicing practitioner, I do think that that's important. I think bits and pieces of how you do the work every day, if we're only tested on the book knowledge, it's a bit that's missing there. So can
Yes.
appreciate that they're focusing on how it's going to be done from day to day. I think it lays the groundwork for the makings of a much more well-rounded therapist,
Yes.
someone who is going to be much better prepared to, or at least thinking more about ethical standards and being much more culturally competent, and
Yes.
prepared for that type of practice.
Yeah,
So I
absolutely.
appreciate it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Again, we can see some of these changes being beneficial. I think, again,
Mhm.
we're seeing a shift toward a more ethical entry level therapist at the end of
Yes.
this exam. I think really the criticism comes down to the maybe the announcement. But let's talk
Yes.
a little bit more about some of the content changes that will also be happening. So, as of 2026, the handbook includes updates that detail content outline and reflection of modern shifts in profession. So, a couple of these that I've highlighted. So, artificial intelligence. So, there's going to be a new emphasis on AI in clinical practice. Cultural competency, as we talked about, there's going to be a revised outline that places a greater weight on cultural competency and diversity. We sort of saw that in
Mhm.
the content domains, and also scenario framing. So, in addition to some of the changes that will be weighted, we'll also see how the exam questions are framed. And also, I
Mhm.
think the idea is that the framing of questions can be a little bit more culturally inclusive, right?
Yes.
So, different types of clinical scenarios candidates will have to navigate. So I'm really kind of curious because inclusion of AI on the national licensing exam is really a massive milestone. Do you think that the exam will focus more on the efficiency of AI, like note taking or diagnostics, or the ethics of AI, like data privacy or the loss of a human element? I'm kind of curious, how do you think students can even begin to study for AI competency when technology is changing faster than the textbooks?
That's a really good question because it is, while I can appreciate that it is being included, it is a splitting hairs where
Yes.
AI is concerned because some people are like, oh, great, bring on the AI. The more the better. We need to be more focused on technology. If not, we'll be left behind, kind of thing. But then there are others that are like, there is no place for this level of technology when you are, working in therapy with people. It is about talking
Yes.
and we can,
Human.
do our notes. Yeah, this is a human based profession,
Mm.
but that's unrealistic. To be too far on either side is unrealistic. So I can appreciate that it's included. And I do think it's important to at least address AI. But like your question brings a point to, how far can we really go with it when AI is still in its maturation phase? Like how much can students at this point really know about? And how competent can they be in something that is still evolving?
Right. Yeah,
And
absolutely.
yeah, like how competent can they be? So I do think
Yes.
questions have to be more on the ethics of
Abs-
it.
I would agree. Yes, I would agree.
Yeah.
I really think it does come down to more of an ethical practice
Hmm.
of AI in your work.
Yeah.
So, again, we could talk about keeping up with AI and understanding all of the things that AI can do. But I
Right.
really think the lens that students can go into as they approach this detail of the exam is really just can we look at AI from the lens of ethics? But then
Right.
another question I'm kind of curious to hear your opinion on is really that this update is really suggesting that cultural competency isn't just its own category, right? It's a
Mhm.
lens in which we can look at other questions, the scenario framing. So I want to ask you, how does the shift of maybe test taking strategy, simply known as definition, to navigating a more complex intersectionality scenarios in every single domain? Like, again, you're talking a little bit more about the practice. How do you think that
Mhm.
will play into maybe just the design of the exam?
I think this is an interesting question, more so because for listeners out there who may not know, I did a little bit of work for Triad in AATBS. with test prep, exam, and reviewing. And so maybe a year or so ago, we started to adapt our questions in the test prep stuff to adapt a more culturally competent view overall. So we
Yes.
started to change the scenarios and change names and change the whole viewpoint of the whole vignette so that the whole question sounded completely different and tried to match up different vignettes to different names. And
Yes.
just as a person who was in that process, it was a very interesting one looking at it from two ways. As the person who wrote the test questions or test prep questions, and a person who took the ASWB exam, not to date myself, but a really long time ago, back in 2009, before those types of things were even discussed
Yes.
heavily or even acknowledged. It was kind of common knowledge amongst, social workers taking and preparing for those types of exams that we should test the way that we were taught in the books
Mm.
and not necessarily what we would do in real life. And so some of that was thinking about the vignettes based on different names.
Yes. Okay.
And so that the vignettes they fit the name of someone that you thought would actually go through the scenario. And so
Mhm.
trying to switch around the vignette to fit the name of the scenario really was an interesting experience. And so to
Mhm.
hear that the national MFT folks are changing their exam to do just that really speaks to how they're evolving to fit what society actually looks like,
Yes.
and
Yes.
being much more aware of who the clientele will actually be.
Yeah.
And so while I don't think it's going to be an easy process because it is going to be a change in how test takers read those questions, how they picture the people in the questions, because a lot of that does actually happen. You read them and you really start to think about, you close your eyes and think about the person in the situation. And so it does take a certain level of cultural competence to think about the person's name and who they might actually be. And so it
Mm.
really calls into question who we think people are based on names, based on situations.
Mm.
And so it is a very interesting look into bias too. So it's a very complex situation, but one that is absolutely necessary because
Yes.
therapists of any background deal with these real life scenarios. So I think
Mhm.
it really speaks to the idea or at least effort to show real life scenarios. We'll be right back after a word from our sponsor.
Are you preparing for a licensure exam in psychology, social work, marriage and family therapy, counseling, or behavioral analysis? AATBS is here to help. We have been supporting behavioral and mental health students to prepare for their licensure exams for more than 45 years, working with over 1 million students to succeed on test day and move on to the next step in their career. With products ranging from comprehensive courses to quiz banks and delivered live online, self-study online, and in print, AATBS has test prep solutions that meet every student's needs and learning styles. Visit us today at aatbs.com. That's aatbs.com and use promo code BHT15 to save 15% off your next purchase.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that perspective. And I think that your experience as a test prep expert kind of shines a light
Mhm.
on the efficacy of the testing programs.
Yeah.
And so, if you're a student, you're wondering how this is going to translate. I think what
Mhm.
you're saying is that test prep companies are already on top of this,
Yeah.
and that your testing experience might actually fall more in line with the actual exam now after March 2026
Mhm.
than it had been before, just because some of the changes you're discussing. I think all the points you're making is that really this is a shift toward a more culturally equal exam,
Mm.
and really trying to level out maybe the curve that we see in people of color and their testing
Mhm.
scores.
Agreed. Because I think across the board, passage rates for, and not just, I know we see it in ASWB, and only because I'm a social worker, I've actually looked at those passage rates, but I do think that it's across the board in multiple other behavioral health related licensure passage rates, that they are lower for people of color.
Yeah.
And I do think some of that has a lot to do with just the cultural competency or lack thereof, or
Yes.
cultural awareness even, in the vignettes, and how there's a lack of diversity within those stories.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree.
Mhm.
So the other part that I want to talk about is really just this lack of transparency and communication on behalf of the AMFTRB. So this is the board that governs the exam. There was no official announcement. So there's no email notification. The website news didn't post or update a tag. There's really kind of inconsistencies as of the announcement. So late March 2026, not exactly sure like when it happened. The AMFTRB website exam information page reportedly still shows an old January outline, while downloading the PDF handbook shows the new March outline. So there's a little inconsistency on the website. And then again, there's two versions of the 2026 handbook that appear identical in design, title making it a little difficult for students to recognize what they're reading, whether it's the revised document or the old one. Really kind of, you have to compare the outlines side by side to see the differences. Again, I see your face squinch for audio listeners.
Yeah.
This is it's kind of a sloppy release.
Huh.
I think when we compare the quiet update to other controversies that we've seen, like with the SWB exam, I think it points to sort of a lack of transparency, especially from a licensing board. It's administrative oversight, even in an ethical violation, right? If we kind of dig
Yeah.
deep enough.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you, like, at what point does that line sort of get crossed against candidates who've really spent thousands of dollars on this and months of their lives preparing? At what point is there maybe like accountability on the board exam? Again, I'm not looking for an exact answer, just kind of like posing this. I want to
Yeah.
hear your thoughts around this.
Right. And you're right, because I was sitting over here like, what? So even though I was prepared to, like, I'd read through this, and I, done a little research on my own. And so I knew that this was what was coming. But to hear it said out loud was even more like, I cannot believe that this is what happened, that there was no official announcement. Uh, I'm a little, I don't know if baffled is too extreme, but a little baffled that there wasn't more to do about these big changes. Because even though the percentage numbers aren't drastic, there is still a change. And like you mentioned, people have been studying for months, have spent thousands of dollars preparing for this test. And to think that potentially money, time, energy have been wasted preparing for something, a life goal, for those things to to potentially have been changed, or the
Yes.
rug pulled from underneath them at the last
Mhm.
moment. Changing potential career paths for people can be detrimental. It is. I'm surprised that it happened this way. And then for it to have not been there in an announcement is one thing. And
Yes.
then for the changes to be inconsistent. And so for candidates to say, okay, well, there wasn't an announcement, so fine. I go onto the website and then I can't even find a consistent, these are what the changes are.
Right.
I agree. Like, where is that line? I would think that this is an ethical violation, because now what do I do? I have been
Right.
preparing for this. What if my test is April 1st or
Yeah.
whatever, and I've been ready for this, and then now I'm no longer ready?
Yeah. I'm just wondering if there's even just
It's a concern for sure.
if there's an accountability on behalf of the board
Mhm.
exams for those that may not have passed. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, is there like an ethical argument that
Yeah.
those that did not pass are actually like owed something?
I think they should be. I think they
Yeah.
should be. Yeah, even if it is all right, you did not pass,
Right.
we're allowing you to retake your exam on us.
Right.
That's our
Yes.
bad.
Yeah. Well, yeah. You really just comes
We
down
messed
to
that
some
up.
governance
Mhm.
on if something were to go wrong, who is taking responsibility for that, And
Right.
then what are those next steps?
Right, right. So I would be curious, especially now a few months in, I do wonder if they're like what level of responsibility they've taken in any things that have gone bad with that. So I'm curious. I did not go that far into my research in it. So I'm curious if, how things have gone for MFTs who've taken that exam.
Yeah. Yeah. So just, to highlight for those that are testing and looking at your handbook, just check to make sure that your study materials are weighted based on the content domains. Most changes involve a shift of a few questions per domain. So these are small tweaks that can help your study schedule better rather than a large overhaul. You want to prioritize a deeper understanding of core clinical concepts over maybe like rote memorization, as you talked about. And then again, talking about the content outline, making sure that we're focused on the handbook from March 2026. That is the content outline that we want to be following going forward.
Right.
We talked a little bit about test anxiety and how that affects a
Hmm.
candidate's clinical mindset when they can't really trust the testing body itself. But if you're heading into a testing center knowing that the handbook was sort of quietly revised a couple weeks ago, how do you keep that frustration from affecting your clinical judgment during the exam?
Hmm. When I was kind of preparing for this and thinking about how do you answer that question, it honestly somewhat feels like maybe how therapy would feel in the moment, right?
Mm,
Because you don't always know how your session is going to go,
yeah.
especially in a situation where you are a marriage and family therapist, because you've got multiple people in front of you who have
Mhm.
all of their different, things happening all at one time. And so maybe that's what it really feels like, right?
Yes.
To be the clinician or the practitioner in that moment. All of these things are coming at you at one time, and you have to still be able to clear your mind and think of the best solution, the best navigation of the system you can do in that exact moment. And so that
Yeah.
is what I would suggest to, test takers who are feeling that level of frustration, that level of anxiety.
Mhm.
Take a deep breath before you go in there. Remind yourself that you were made for this, that this is what it's like for real. This is in that moment. I can do this. Take that deep breath and know, do what you can do. But then also the social worker in me must tell you that you have to advocate for yourself. Make those calls
Mm.
to the national MFT board of your area, express your frustration and discuss what changes and levels of accountability that you would like for them to be held accountable to. If the changes can't be made if you don't advocate for them. But again, know that you are made for this and you got it.
Yeah, I so appreciate that perspective. Again, this is sort of the work that we're in. I recently had a great conversation, and it was really like, talking about the power of improv, right? Life
Yeah.
sort of comes
Yeah.
at you, and sometimes we just have to say yes and, right?
Mm.
And this is what I think one of those situations, like, yeah, it stinks that there
Mhm.
might have been some confusion, miscommunication around it. Yes, but this is sort of the work that we do.
Mhm.
And, as we mentioned before, these are small tweaks. So it's not like all of your studying has gone out the window. It's just a
Right.
little bit of a recalibration, right?
Right. Right.
And I can appreciate the advocacy, right? Because we're going through this testing process. Others are going to go through it
Mhm.
again. Again, we are all human. And so
Mhm.
if there's opportunities for us to advocate for others
Right.
and for opportunities for improvement, then, I think having our voices heard is important. So
It absolutely
I
is.
can appreciate your advocacy there.
Yeah.
So really, I want to kind of wrap this one up, but this shift really kind of takes in a lot, right?
Mm.
It's a recalibration, not a restart. The core of what we do as MFTs, it's a systemic clinical heart, it remains the same. If you're testing soon, our best advice is to head to the AMFTRB site today. Don't look at the exam information on the page. Download the actual PDF of the March 2026 handbook. Look at those domains, weights, check on the new AI in telehealth, adjust your focus where it matters. Unexpected changes are definitely frustrating, but staying informed is really your best defense. Put this episode together. I cross referenced latest updates from the AMFTRB board website. Excellent deep dives from psychotherapy notes as well as the AATBS blog. So I highly recommend looking all of those. They are essential resources for tracking these shifts in real time and keeping your prep right on track. So I want to thank you all for joining our episode of BHT Bytes. I appreciate you being part of this community, and we'll see you next time on Behavioral Health Today.
We appreciate all the support from our community, and if you like our show, one of the best ways you can support it is by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review. Behavioral Health Today is a podcast part of the Tried Behavioral Health Network, all rights reserved.